My family laughed at my poor job. Now their future depends on the man they shamed. The clamor in the grand living room was deafening, a symphony of panicked whispers, tearful exclamations, and furious accusations. His cousin, Sterling, stood at the epicenter of the storm, his usually impeccably tailored suit rumpled, his face a mask of disbelief and anger. It's gone. All of it. A lifetime of family legacy, wiped out by a single, cursed oversight, he bellowed, his voice cracking with a raw emotion Silas had rarely witnessed. Around him, aunts dabbed at their eyes with lace handkerchiefs, uncles grumbled into their brandy snifters, and younger cousins stared blankly at their suddenly uncertain futures. Silas, however, merely sat in his usual armchair by the forgotten fireplace, a quiet observer amidst the chaos. A faint, almost imperceptible smile played on his lips, a secret warmth spreading through his chest. They saw despair in Sterling's eyes, but Silas saw only the final act of a play he had long anticipated. They saw ruin, but he saw a clean slate, a necessary unraveling before the true structure could emerge. His hands, calloused from years of delicate work, rested calmly on his lap, betraying none of the quiet certainty that now filled him. They assumed he was just as lost, just as helpless as they were, perhaps even more so, given his unprofitable profession. But he knew better. He always did. The very skills they had mocked, the quiet patience he had dismissed as eccentricity, were the very threads he had been weaving, meticulously, silently, for years, to catch them when their grand, glittering edifice finally collapsed. His tranquility in that moment of apparent disaster wasn't a sign of ignorance, it was the quiet confidence of a craftsman who had already completed his most intricate work, simply waiting for the world to catch up. The truth, like a rare, precious manuscript, had been carefully preserved, its value ignored until the precise moment it needed most. And that moment, he knew, had finally arrived. His journey to that quiet certainty had been a long one, paved not with the shimmering asphalt of quick deals and grand pronouncements, but with the delicate, almost imperceptible dust of centuries. From a young age, while other children fantasized about becoming astronauts or titans of industry, Silas found solace and profound wonder in the musty smell of old libraries and the brittle touch of ancient paper. His first encounter with a truly old book, a leather-bound volume of forgotten poetry discovered tucked away in his grandfather's study, had been a revelation. The scent of aging paper, the faint foxing on the yellowed pages, the delicate weight of history in his hands, it had spoken to him in a way no bustling playground ever could. His passion wasn't for invention or conquest, but for preservation, for coaxing forgotten stories back to life. He pored over texts, not for their financial worth, but for their intrinsic value, the whispers of history, the silent testament to human thought and endeavor. He would spend hours in antique shops, not browsing for furniture, but poring over forgotten boxes of ephemera, discarded letters, and tattered maps. While his peers collected baseball cards, he meticulously mended torn book jackets with transparent tissue and archival glue, or carefully unfolded brittle deeds, captivated by the elegant script of a bygone era. He recalled one childhood afternoon, a particularly vivid memory, when he discovered an old, discarded family diary in the attic, its pages so fragile they crumbled at the touch. He spent weeks, armed with newfound knowledge from a dusty library book on paper repair, carefully mending it, piece by agonizing piece. The process, slow and demanding, taught him not just the mechanics of restoration, but the deep satisfaction of bringing something invaluable back from the brink of oblivion. His small workshop, a converted carriage house at the edge of the family estate, became his sanctuary. It smelled of aged vellum, specialized chemicals, the faint tang of deacidifying solutions, the subtle sweetness of conservation adhesives, and the subtle, earthy aroma of time itself. Here, surrounded by the ghosts of forgotten narratives, he meticulously mended torn pages, deacidified fragile manuscripts, and painstakingly preserved texts that countless others had deemed lost or beyond repair. He learned the delicate dance of drying pages, the precise temperature for mending a spine, the alchemy of bringing faded ink back to a semblance of its former vibrancy. He acquired an almost encyclopedic knowledge of paper types, historical inks, and binding techniques. It was a laborious, often solitary pursuit, demanding an almost monastic dedication, a boundless patience, and a forensic attention to detail that few possessed, and even fewer appreciated. He remembered one particular afternoon, hunched over a medieval illuminated manuscript, repairing a minute tear no larger than a grain of rice, the work requiring hours of painstaking concentration. The satisfaction, when the repair was invisible, seamless, was a quiet, profound joy that surpassed any fleeting thrill his family pursued. To him, each saved page was a victory, a silent defiance against the relentless erosion of time. His family, however, inhabited a different universe. They were a lineage obsessed with progress, with acquisition, with the tangible metrics of success. To them, a building was only valuable if it generated rent, an investment only worthwhile if it doubled in 6 months, a legacy only quantifiable in zeros on a bank statement. His father, a shrewd investor with an eagle eye for market trends, had often clamped his jaw in polite disapproval when Silas spoke of his aspirations. "Silas," he would say, his voice laced with a mixture of concern and bewilderment, "there's no future in gluing bits of dust together. Where's the profit? Where's the legacy you can leave?" The question was always delivered with a sigh that spoke volumes of his unspoken worry for his seemingly directionless son. His mother, gentler but equally perplexed, would often suggest he find a more practical hobby, perhaps something involving stocks or real estate. He knew they loved him, in their own way, but their understanding of value was fundamentally alien to his own. He often heard snippets of conversations between his parents, hushed worries about his future, and whether he would ever settle down into a proper career. He understood their perspective, rooted in generations of striving, but he could not, would not, abandon the quiet call of the past. But no one embodied this ethos more acutely than his cousin, Sterling. From their childhood, their paths diverged sharply, almost comically so. While Silas meticulously organized his stamp collection, cataloging each delicate perforation, tracing the subtle differences in watermarks under a magnifying glass, Sterling was already orchestrating elaborate neighborhood lemonade stands, negotiating prices with a precocious, almost unsettling zeal. He had once, at the age of 10, convinced a group of older boys to invest their allowances in a scheme to corner the market on rare marbles, only for it to spectacularly collapse, leaving Sterling with a valuable lesson and the other boys with empty pockets. Yet, even in defeat, Sterling displayed a resilience and a relentless drive for the next venture. His world was one of aggressive expansion, of dazzling displays of wealth, of the relentless pursuit of the next big deal. He thrived on the roar of the market, the adrenaline of the gamble, the public affirmation of his financial prowess. To him, the past was merely a faded backdrop, irrelevant to the vibrant, forward-moving thrust of the present. He saw history as a set of static facts, not a living, breathing narrative that shaped the present. Family gatherings were, for Silas, a particularly refined form of torture. Sterling, always arriving in a gleaming new luxury car, a different one each year, each more ostentatious than the last, a testament to his ever-growing portfolio of assets, would stride in, radiating an aura of self-congratulatory triumph. He'd flash his designer watch, a constant, glittering reminder of his latest million-dollar conquest, and then, inevitably, his gaze would land on Silas, a glint of amused pity in his eyes. Still playing with old papers, Silas, he'd scoff, his voice carrying just enough to be overheard by their assembled relatives, a theatrical whisper designed for maximum impact. "While I'm closing million-dollar deals, you're gluing bits of dust together." The chuckles that followed varied in their intent. Some were genuinely amused by what they perceived as his quaint, harmless eccentricity, a charming if unproductive hobby. Others were laced with a genuine, if misguided, pity for his poor and profitable job, a concern for his apparent lack of ambition. His aunts, like Millicent and Eleanor, would sigh, exchanging knowing glances as if discussing a troubled child. His uncles, like George, would clear their throats awkwardly, shifting their weight, uncomfortable with the bluntness but unable to argue with Sterling's perceived success. Silas would simply nod, a quiet smile on his face, a silent understanding passing between himself and the ancient parchment that was his true confidant. He didn't care for their fast money, their fleeting triumphs. He preferred the quiet, profound satisfaction of bringing something invaluable back to life, something that possessed a permanence beyond the volatile whims of the market. They saw bits of dust, he saw the very foundation of civilization. A subtle irony often played in his mind: they built their empires on the shifting sands of speculation, while he meticulously restored the bedrock. What they, and Sterling in particular, failed to grasp was that his hobby was not merely a quaint pastime. It was a discipline, a science, an art, and, most importantly, a unique form of knowledge that intertwined the tangible with the abstract. His secret weapon wasn't a sudden invention or a grand scheme he cooked up in a moment of desperation. It was the culmination of decades of meticulous study, of understanding not just the physical properties of paper and ink, but the deeper meaning embedded within the texts themselves. He had delved into paleography, the study of ancient writing, to an extent few contemporary scholars bothered with. He had spent years deciphering forgotten scripts from forgotten kingdoms, learning to distinguish the subtle nuances of a scribe's hand, to recognize the specific materials used in different eras. He had mastered obscure languages and forgotten dialects, not because he intended to use them for profit, but because they were keys to unlocking the past, to understanding the evolution of human thought and, sometimes, the very foundations of families like theirs. To him, each faded letter, each crumbling margin, was a clue, a whisper from history waiting to be heard. He had once spent an entire year meticulously transcribing a set of medieval legal documents for a university, not for substantial pay, but for the sheer intellectual challenge and the thrill of connecting with the minds of centuries past. That experience had sharpened his skills, preparing him for a task he didn't yet know awaited him. Years ago, out of a sheer academic curiosity and a desire to understand his own lineage beyond the superficial accounts passed down at boisterous family dinners, Silas had begun a quiet, methodical study of his family's ancestral documents. He had started with the family Bible, a surprisingly well-preserved volume that contained cryptic marginalia, faint symbols etched in the margins next to names and dates. This discovery piqued his interest, leading him down a winding path. He ventured into the dusty archives of old county courthouses, meticulously sifting through brittle records. He persuaded distant relatives, often with surprising difficulty, to open forgotten trunks in their attics, which sometimes yielded unexpected treasures. He even spent weeks in the backrooms of old law firms that still held paper records from centuries past, patiently explaining his research, slowly gaining their trust. There, he had uncovered a labyrinthine network of old trusts, deeds, and agreements that predated the modern corporate structures his family now so blindly trusted. These were documents written in the elegant, looping script of the 18th and 19th centuries, often in archaic legal language, sometimes even containing clauses written in a cipher, a common practice among certain wealthy families of that era to protect their true assets from prying eyes or future disputes. The initial discovery of a small, barely perceptible symbol on the edge of one deed, identical to a symbol he had found in the family Bible, had solidified his resolve, sending him down a rabbit hole of historical cryptography. He learned that his family's wealth, far from being solely dependent on the volatile stock market and Sterling's grand deals, was underpinned by a series of remarkably resilient, almost unbreakable, perpetual trusts. These trusts, established by more prescient ancestors who had lived through economic depressions, political upheavals, and even wars, were designed to weather any storm, provided their intricate stipulations were understood and properly maintained. Most of his family, focused on immediate returns and the flashy success of the present, had long dismissed these foundational documents as mere historical curiosities, or worse, as an unnecessary burden. Sterling, with his characteristic impatience, had even tried to modernize some of them, unaware of the delicate legal architecture he was tampering with, his attempts often resulting in minor, yet significant, alterations that unknowingly chipped away at their true protections, like a blind man unknowingly dismantling a complex clock. Silas had spent countless nights hunched over these brittle papers, restoring them inch by painful inch, deacidifying them to prevent further decay, flattening their stubborn creases with gentle weights, and patiently reattaching torn sections with near-invisible precision. He used scalpels finer than a surgeon's and glues so subtle they seemed to disappear into the paper itself, leaving no trace of his intervention. Then came the deciphering. The cipher was not simple, it was a layered system, requiring not just a key, but an understanding of linguistic patterns, historical context, and even subtle shifts in the family's own internal communication, hinted at in other, less important, family papers. He consulted ancient dictionaries, obscure historical texts on coded correspondence, and even biographical details of the original trust creators, searching for any hint of their particular intellectual habits or private languages. He even developed a theory, later confirmed, that certain words were intentionally misspelled or hyphenated in specific ways to indicate a shift to the coded language. It was not a grand, active plan to save them, but a quiet, almost intuitive preparation. He knew, with a certainty that transcended mere intellect, that the superficial prosperity they chased was inherently fragile. The real strength, the true legacy, lay in the very things they ignored, the very things he cherished. His secret weapon was not a thing he created, it was a truth he unearthed, a wisdom he painstakingly restored, waiting patiently for the moment the family's self-made illusion of security would inevitably crumble. And so, he continued his quiet work, a diligent guardian of forgotten truths, while the world outside his workshop spiraled ever faster, convinced of its own fleeting cleverness, oblivious to the anchor that was slowly being restored beneath its waves. The first tremors of the earthquake came subtly, like the faintest vibrations through the floorboards of an old house. Sterling, usually bursting with new ventures and boasting of acquisitions, grew quieter. His boasts became less frequent, his designer watches seemed to lose a little of their luster, though he still wore them, perhaps out of habit or denial. Family dinners, once dominated by his boisterous pronouncements, now had long silences where only the clinking of silverware could be heard, a stark contrast to the usual cacophony. Then came the phone calls, hushed and urgent, always taken in the solitude of his study or a deserted corner of the house, his voice low and tense, often ending with a frustrated slam of the receiver. Silas observed these shifts, not with schadenfreude, but with a detached, almost scientific interest. He had seen this pattern before, in the histories of other great families whose fortunes had risen and fallen due to similar hubris. He noted the increasing frequency of lawyers visiting the estate, their faces grim, their briefcases bulging with documents. Finally, the inevitable crash. A series of Sterling's groundbreaking investments, leveraged to the hilt with family capital and borrowed funds, had unraveled with astonishing speed. A complex real estate venture in a volatile market, dependent on a major infrastructure project that had been indefinitely delayed, withered into a legal quagmire of lawsuits and countersuits. A tech startup that promised the moon but delivered only dust, consuming millions before evaporating like a mirage. A series of questionable partnerships in emerging markets dissolved into defaults and international litigation. The family, relying almost entirely on his supposed Midas touch, found themselves staring into an abyss of debt and lawsuits, their personal assets, once thought untouchable, suddenly entangled in the legal morass. Their legacy, which Sterling had so confidently managed, was now teetering on the brink of utter annihilation. As panic set in, Sterling, true to form, amplified his efforts, but this time, his frantic energy was born of desperation, not confidence. He paced ceaselessly, wearing paths into the expensive rugs of his study, muttering to himself. He barked orders into his phone, his voice hoarse, his temper quick, snapping at assistants and family members alike. He convened endless, increasingly heated meetings with a battery of lawyers and financial advisors who looked more and more haggard with each passing week, their faces etched with exhaustion and frustration. His usual polished demeanor frayed, revealing a man terrified and out of his depth, his once immaculate suits now often rumpled, his hair disheveled. He tried to sell off assets, but the market was unforgiving, recognizing the stench of desperation, and the family's holdings were too intertwined, too encumbered by the unraveling deals and mounting liens. He attempted to renegotiate, to litigate, to bluff his way out, but his usual charm and aggression fell flat against the stone wall of reality. The world outside, unconcerned with his personal brand or the weight of his family name, simply demanded payment. He even started to blame everyone around him, the economy, the lawyers, the poor advice he'd been given, the unreliable partners, even his own family for not being supportive enough, anyone but himself. His strength, his unwavering belief in his own infallible judgment, had become his greatest weakness, blinding him to the very real dangers he had courted. He grew gaunt, his eyes bloodshot, his movements jerky. He slept little, ate less, consumed by the spiraling catastrophe he had wrought. During this tumultuous period, Silas maintained his quiet routine. While the family held their crisis meetings, wringing their hands and lamenting their misfortune, he would be in his workshop, the scent of old paper and chemicals a comforting balm. He didn't offer unsolicited advice, nor did he join their lamentations. He simply observed, a silent sentinel amidst the storm. His silence, he observed, was consistently misinterpreted. Sterling, in his heightened state of anxiety, saw it as disengagement, perhaps even a tacit admission of Silas's own uselessness in their grand, material world. "Still playing with your papers, Silas," he'd snapped one evening, his voice tight with frustration, his face contorted, a vein throbbing in his temple. "We're losing everything, and you're gluing bits of dust together as if nothing has changed." His tone was laced with more contempt than usual, born of his own fear and inability to comprehend a world where value existed outside of a spreadsheet. He saw Silas's quiet solitude as a form of detachment, a failure to engage with the real problems. His aunts would cast sympathetic glances Silas's way, assuming he was simply too meek, too unworldly to grasp the gravity of their financial collapse. Some of the younger cousins, perhaps sensing the shift in the family's mood, would occasionally venture into his workshop, their initial curiosity about his strange tools giving way to a quiet fascination with the delicate work, but they too were quickly pulled back into the vortex of family panic. Their dismissiveness, however, was precisely what Silas needed. It allowed him to work unimpeded, a ghost moving through their panic, an unnoticed presence preparing the very lifeline they would soon desperately grasp for. He meticulously reviewed his work, double-checking every restoration, every deciphered character, every translated clause, ensuring that when the moment came, his offering would be flawless. He even took the time to create elaborate, hand-drawn diagrams that would visually explain the complex legal structure, knowing that the family, accustomed to flashy presentations, would need clear, undeniable evidence. His plan wasn't a dramatic, theatrical unveiling, but a series of quiet, almost invisible actions. While Sterling thrashed about in a desperate attempt to save face and fortune, publicly negotiating, privately raging, Silas systematically retrieved the restored family documents from the climate-controlled vaults in his workshop. He placed them carefully on his large, custom-built worktable, illuminated by a specialized light that revealed every nuance of the ancient parchment. He cross-referenced the ancient cipher with the current legal filings, identifying the precise clauses and conditions that held the key to their salvation. He wasn't just restoring paper, he was restoring the truth, piece by painstaking piece, connecting the distant past to the urgent present. He didn't explain himself. He didn't announce his intentions. He simply observed, listened to the distant echoes of their despair, and meticulously prepared. He knew the exact moment to act, and it wouldn't be on his terms, but on theirs. It would be when their desperation reached its absolute nadir, when all of Sterling's grand schemes and modern machinations had demonstrably failed, when every conventional avenue had led to a dead end. Only then would they be truly ready to see the quiet, overlooked path. His quiet confidence was not born of arrogance, but of a deep, almost spiritual understanding of timing, of the way the world, in its own unpredictable rhythm, eventually revealed its true needs. He watched Sterling's frantic efforts with a detached, almost clinical eye, allowing him to exhaust every conventional avenue, every smart solution, every high-stakes gamble. The more he failed, the more desperate he became, the more the family lost hope, the clearer the path became for Silas. The stage was being set, not by his design, but by the relentless march of their own mistakes. And soon, the curtain would rise. The air in the family boardroom was thick with an oppressive silence, broken only by the occasional sniffle from Aunt Millicent or the rustle of Sterling's agitated pacing. It was the final meeting, called by the family's senior legal counsel, Mr. Davies, a man known for his unflappable demeanor, now looking unusually grim, his shoulders slumped. He was there to deliver the grim news. The last of Sterling's desperate maneuvers, a complex bankruptcy filing that had been rejected, a last-ditch plea to a long-forgotten business associate that had been rebuffed, had failed. The once great family fortune, built over generations, was now officially deemed irrecoverable by conventional means. A somber-faced Mr. Davies cleared his throat, adjusting his spectacles, preparing to deliver the final, crushing blow. Sterling stood by the vast window overlooking the city skyline, his shoulders slumped, his usual swagger replaced by an almost palpable despair. His gaze was fixed on the distant skyscrapers, perhaps remembering the heights he had once scaled, or imagined scaling, before his world crumbled. He had finally run out of options, out of bluster, out of hope. "We have explored every avenue, Mr. Sterling," the lawyer stated, his voice devoid of emotion, a mere conduit for the cold, hard facts. "But the liabilities far outweigh the remaining assets. The trusts, as they stand, are too complex, too encumbered by old, often contradictory clauses, and frankly, too arcane for modern interpretation. Our digitized copies are incomplete, and the originals are considered too fragile, or even illegible, to be useful in court. It appears there is nothing more to be done." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Aunt Millicent openly wept, her lace handkerchief now soaked, her shoulders shaking. Uncle George, usually stoic and reserved, buried his face in his hands, a low groan escaping him. Younger cousins, wide-eyed, seemed to shrink in their seats, their faces reflecting the despair of their elders. Sterling slowly turned from the window, his eyes hollow, defeated, reflecting the barren landscape of his ruined ambitions. It was a moment of absolute, unadulterated desolation. The weight of generations of expectation, of accumulated wealth and status, had just collapsed into dust. It was precisely then that Silas chose to speak. His voice, calm and clear, cut through the heavy silence like a sharp blade. "Perhaps," he said, rising slowly from his seat at the far end of the long mahogany table, a spot he had chosen intentionally, allowing him to observe the entire room and their reactions, "there is one avenue you haven't yet explored." All eyes, heavy with misery and disbelief, swiveled towards him. Sterling stared, a flicker of annoyance, almost contempt, in his defeated gaze. "Silas, please," he muttered, his voice raspy, barely audible, "not now. We're past your historical anecdotes. This is not the time for quaint musings or academic theories." Silas ignored him, his gaze sweeping across the faces of his family, recognizing the shock, the confusion, and the lingering dismissal in their eyes. He understood their skepticism. For so long, he had been the quiet outlier, the one who didn't fit, whose pursuits were a source of bemusement. For decades, he continued, his voice gaining a quiet resonance, a subtle power, "I have dedicated my life to preserving what you deemed inconsequential. Bits of dust," as Sterling so eloquently put it. But sometimes, cousin, dust holds the most profound truths, the most resilient foundations. He walked with measured steps to the head of the table, pulling a slim, leather-bound portfolio from a discreet, unassuming bag he had brought. He laid it gently on the polished wood, the soft thud echoing slightly in the silent room. The rich scent of aged leather and ancient paper subtly filled the air. "What is that, Silas?" his Aunt Eleanor asked, her voice trembling, a flicker of bewildered hope in her eyes, though she quickly suppressed it, almost ashamed of letting it show. "This," Silas stated, his hand resting on the portfolio, "is the original foundational trust document of our family's wealth, dating back to 1782. It has been meticulously restored, page by painstakingly restored page, a labor of years, not days." He opened the portfolio, revealing parchment that looked surprisingly vibrant, its script elegant and clear, though undeniably ancient. Gasps filled the room, murmurs of astonishment breaking the silence, as family members leaned forward, straining to see. But that was deemed illegible," Mr. Davies stammered, leaning forward, his professional curiosity overriding his despair, a new light dawning in his experienced eyes. He reached for his glasses, pushing them up his nose, as if to see more clearly. "And we have digitized versions. They show nothing that could possibly—" "Ah, the digitized versions," Silas interrupted, a faint, almost mischievous smile touching his lips. "They captured the visible script, yes. But they missed what was hidden. You see," he explained, his voice calm, almost pedagogical, as if lecturing a rapt class on a fascinating historical discovery, "our ancestors, much like others of their time, employed a clever method of securing their true wealth. They created a perpetual trust, designed to be untouchable, with a final, crucial clause embedded not in plain sight, but within a sophisticated cipher, woven into the very fabric of the document's design and written in a forgotten dialect of legal Latin." He allowed a moment for the sheer audacity of this statement to sink in, for the impossible to begin to feel possible. He then pulled out another document, a beautifully rendered diagram on a large, restored sheet of paper, covered in meticulous notes and precise drawings that highlighted patterns and hidden symbols. "This," he said, holding it up for all to see, "is a detailed analysis of the document's structure, cross-referenced with various historical precedents and, most importantly, the key to the cipher." It required an understanding not just of antiquated legal terms, but of the specific cultural and linguistic nuances of the period. It required an expert in paleography, a skilled conservator, and someone with an intimate knowledge of our family's unique history and the subtle patterns embedded in their communication. He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle, his gaze meeting Sterling's, who was now staring, utterly transfixed, his mouth slightly agape. "Someone, you might say, who spent his life gluing bits of dust together. Sterling's face, which had slowly shifted from despair to confused irritation, now contorted into a mask of pure disbelief, bordering on a raw, unadulterated fear. "A cipher? You're telling us a children's puzzle is going to save us from millions in debt," he scoffed, but the usual force was gone from his voice, replaced by a strained, desperate plea for normalcy, a desperate clinging to his own familiar reality. "It is no child's puzzle, Sterling," Silas corrected him, his tone gentle but firm, carrying the weight of indisputable authority and years of painstaking work. "It is a highly sophisticated, multi-layered cipher, one that evaded even the most diligent of your modern legal teams and digital scans. And what it reveals is this: a clause, previously undiscovered, that stipulates a significant portion of the family's assets, held in an offshore, perpetually renewing fund, can only be accessed under very specific conditions that, coincidentally, mirror our current state of financial distress, a state of near-total ruin brought about by external market forces and, regrettably, internal mismanagement." He allowed that barb to land, subtly, without malice, simply as a statement of fact. Furthermore, it designates an independent, family-appointed executor with the specific skills to authenticate and interpret the original document should any modern legal challenge arise. Someone, in short, who understands its true, physical, and historical context, not just its fleeting digital representation. He looked directly at Sterling, then at Mr. Davies, who was now practically breathless with professional wonder, his eyes darting between Silas and the ancient parchment. "The fund is not just substantial, it is designed to be self-sustaining, provided its terms are properly honored. Terms which, incidentally, the modern digital copies failed to fully convey," and which your previous attempts to modernize nearly nullified, cousin. Had I not intervened, had I not painstakingly restored every detail, this safety net would have dissolved into nothingness, leaving us all truly destitute. The room was utterly silent. The lawyer, a man who had seen everything from corporate takeovers to intricate inheritance battles, was now leaning over the table, his eyes wide with a mixture of professional awe and dawning realization. He reached out a trembling hand and carefully touched the ancient parchment, then the deciphered diagram, his fingers tracing the elegant script as if expecting it to disappear, to prove itself a trick. Sterling, however, stood frozen, his jaw slack, his face an ashen gray, all color drained away. The grand, glittering edifice of his self-assured success had not just crumbled, it had been utterly eclipsed by the quiet, overlooked brilliance of what he had so vehemently dismissed. His bits of dust had just saved them all. The truth, meticulously uncovered, now shone with an undeniable brilliance that cast a long shadow over all their previous assumptions, illuminating their blindness. The reveal hit Sterling like a physical blow. The color drained from his face, leaving him pale and gaunt, almost spectral. He stumbled back, bumping into his chair, a strangled, guttural sound escaping his throat. "No, no, it can't be," he whispered, his voice thin and reedy, completely devoid of its usual booming confidence and bluster. He looked at Silas, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock, betrayal, and a horrifying understanding that shattered his entire worldview. The man who had always been so loud, so dominant, so utterly convinced of his own superiority, was now reduced to a trembling, broken figure. His entire identity, built on the shifting sands of quick deals and material success, had just been utterly dismantled by the quiet, enduring power of knowledge he had scorned. He sank into his chair, head in his hands, completely defeated, a shadow of his former self. The rest of the family reacted with a wave of conflicting emotions. First, there was profound shock, followed by a dawning comprehension, then immense, almost dizzying relief. Aunt Millicent, who had been weeping moments before, now stared at Silas with wide, tear-filled eyes, a silent apology in her gaze, a profound shift from pity to admiration etched on her face. Uncle George, who had dismissed Silas's profession as a quaint hobby, now cleared his throat, a deep flush spreading across his face, his embarrassment palpable, yet overshadowed by dawning hope. A chorus of staggered, embarrassed murmurs filled the room. "Silas, you mean, all this time?" Someone began, unable to finish the sentence, the implications too vast to immediately grasp, too revolutionary for their entrenched beliefs. Cousin Bethany, who had always been a quiet supporter of Silas's unusual interests, simply nodded, a knowing, almost vindicated smile on her lips, a silent acknowledgement of his long-ignored wisdom. They started to apologize, one by one, their voices choked with shame and gratitude. "We were so blind, Silas," his Aunt Eleanor whispered, her hand reaching out to touch his arm tentatively, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "We never truly understood. We were so caught up in Sterling's world, in the glitter of quick money." Their words, however, held little interest for Silas. He had never sought their validation, only their understanding, which had always been conspicuously absent. He simply nodded, acknowledging their belated recognition without gloating or triumphant words. There was no need for grand pronouncements or triumphant speeches on his part. The truth, meticulously restored and now laid bare, spoke for itself, echoing through the newfound silence of the boardroom with undeniable authority. Mr. Davies, now fully immersed, quickly confirmed the veracity of Silas's findings. He meticulously reviewed the restored document and Silas's deciphered notes, cross-referencing them with his own extensive knowledge of legal history and modern financial regulations. His initial skepticism gave way to open admiration, then professional reverence, as he recognized the sheer genius of the ancient trust in Silas's masterful restoration. He even produced a small magnifying glass from his briefcase, examining the fine details of Silas's repairs and annotations, murmuring words of professional awe under his breath. "Mr. Silas," he said, his voice imbued with a newfound respect, a deference he rarely showed anyone, "this is extraordinary. This changes everything. The fund is indeed substantial, and these conditions, while obscure, are perfectly legitimate and legally binding. This is not just a recovery, it's a profound re-establishment of your family's financial security, entirely thanks to your unique expertise." His words were a professional endorsement that resonated more deeply than any family apology ever could, a validation of a lifetime of quiet, dedicated work. Sterling, meanwhile, had retreated further into himself. He sat slumped in his chair, head in his hands, completely defeated, seemingly oblivious to the swirling emotions around him. The vibrant, self-assured man was gone, replaced by a hollow shell, his ambition and confidence utterly extinguished. His fall from grace was absolute and public, a stark contrast to Silas's quiet, almost invisible rise. Silas felt no malice, no desire for revenge. Merely a quiet satisfaction in the symmetry of it all. The world, in its own unpredictable way, had simply corrected an imbalance, restoring true value to its rightful place. He had always known that his bits of dust were more substantial than Sterling's million-dollar deals. Now, they knew it too. The silence in the room was no longer one of despair, but of stunned awe, and a profound, collective re-evaluation of what truly constituted wealth and legacy. Months passed since that pivotal meeting in the family boardroom. The storm had cleared, leaving behind a tranquil, if somewhat chastened, landscape. The family's finances were not only stabilized but, thanks to the rediscovered trust, were now more robust and securely managed than they had been in generations. The legal teams, initially bewildered by the antiquity and complexity of the documents, had embraced Silas's meticulously restored documents and his detailed interpretations, leveraging them to navigate the complex legal landscape and unlock the ancestral funds. The unprofitable work of Silas, the restorer, had effectively saved the entire lineage, securing their future in a way Sterling's aggressive ventures never could, providing a stability they had never truly appreciated. Silas's life, on the surface, remained much the same. He still spent his days in his workshop, the familiar scent of old paper and specialized chemicals a constant comfort, a comforting cocoon from the outside world. His hands, still calloused from delicate work, continued their intricate dance of preservation, coaxing fragile texts back to life, each repair a silent testament to his enduring passion. Yet, there was a profound difference in the air, a quiet undercurrent of respect that had replaced the former pity and dismissal. Family members now sought his counsel, not on financial matters, but on matters of history, of legacy, of things that endured beyond mere currency. They commissioned him to restore their own cherished, often neglected, family heirlooms, old letters, faded photographs, brittle diaries, each with its own story, its own fragile link to the past. His sanctuary remained his sanctuary, but it was no longer a place of quiet defiance, but of quiet, almost reverent appreciation. They had learned, finally, to see the value in what they could not immediately monetize, to understand that some treasures transcend market value, holding a deeper, more profound worth. Even his father, now older and wiser, occasionally visited the workshop, not to question, but to observe, a quiet nod of approval on his face, a silent acknowledgement of the path his son had chosen. Sterling's path was a more arduous one. He had been humbled beyond measure, his ego utterly shattered by the public collapse of his empire and the quiet triumph of his cousin. He had, Silas heard, sold off his luxury cars and moved into a more modest dwelling, shedding the outward symbols of his former life. He no longer chased the grand, flashy deals, but was, perhaps, learning the quiet discipline of rebuilding, not just his finances, but his character, finding a quieter, more sustainable path. His interactions with Silas were infrequent, and marked by a polite, almost cautious silence. The easy contempt was gone, replaced by a strained respect, a quiet acknowledgement of the profound shift in their respective standings. Silas never gloated, never brought up the past. There was no need. The lesson, etched into the very fabric of their recovery, was far more potent than any words he could utter. He sometimes wondered if Sterling, in his quiet moments, now pondered the true meaning of legacy, and whether he had begun to appreciate the enduring value of something truly well-preserved. Silas's greatest satisfaction, however, came not from their belated respect, nor from Sterling's humbling, but from the simple, profound confirmation of a truth he had always held dear. True value, he learned, isn't always loud or flashy. Often, it's found in the quiet persistence, the overlooked details, and the unwavering dedication to what truly matters beyond the fleeting whims of the market. It's in the patient pursuit of mastery, the deep understanding of obscure knowledge, and the silent strength of conviction that allows one to stand firm while the world around them chases phantoms. Real wealth, he discovered, lies not in what one accumulates quickly, but in what one preserves diligently, for the benefit of all, even those who initially mock its worth. It's a lesson that transcends the family boardroom, echoing through the ages. The quiet, often unglamorous work, when pursued with passion and integrity, ultimately holds a power far greater than any momentary display of opulence or fleeting success. And as he continued his quiet work, surrounded by the whispers of history, he knew that the greatest stories were not always those shouted from the rooftops, but those carefully, lovingly, preserved in the silence, waiting for the right moment to reveal their profound truth. If you enjoyed this story about overlooked value and quiet mastery, be sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss similar narratives. What do you think was the most profound lesson the family learned? Have you ever witnessed someone undervalue something only to realize its true worth later? Share your thoughts in the comments below.